G'day guys, it's Jarryd here from Archery, and in today's video I'm going to give you my top 3 tips for maintaining shoulder health for archers. So archers tend to get a lot of shoulder injuries, but that doesn't have to be the case. So what I'm going to be talking about in today's video is a number of tips, tricks and hacks that I've consolidated over the last 10, 12 years of training, coaching and working with some of the country's best practitioners, sports physiologists, physios, chiros, and kind of consolidating that into some preventative and management techniques that you can use to both prevent injury but also maintain optimal shoulder health so that you can perform to your maximum ability. So the first thing you need to do to maintain shoulder health as an archer is to work on your shoulder mobility, okay? Now modern lifestyle is bad enough for shoulder mobility. We tend to spend our days hunched over phones, working on computers, slouched over desks, and all that work slouched over in this position tends to kind of create really tight internal rotators and pectorals and very weak, loose back muscles and scapular retractors, okay? But archery makes that even worse because it's such an asymmetrical movement through a really short range of motion when you think about it. And it doesn't utilize the full range of the shoulder girdle. And so if you don't maintain proper shoulder mobility and work in mobility drills into your warm-up and your training exercises, then you're bound to build up like an accumulation of tightness in the shoulder girdle, which is going to manifest into all kinds of shoulder issues. Okay, so there's a number of things you can do to improve shoulder mobility. I have a couple of drills that I really work into, warm-up routines, and also like my training and training programs. And so that includes drills with a stretchy band, where you're sort of working through the full range of motion, training the muscles to contract and extend through the full range of motion of the shoulder girdle, really to kind of train and open up those pecs as well. And I also really like an exercise called dislocates, where you take a simple broomstick and by moving in a large circular motion in 2 directions, okay, that really opens up the shoulder girdle and is particularly good for stretching the pectorals. It's actually a really hard drill to master, so I recommend people start with a stretchy band so they don't pull anything, but over time you can work up to using a rigid broomstick, and from there you can progress on to even adding weights to the drill. So the other thing to consider with shoulder mobility is that if you don't use it, you lose it. And in archery, this is very true. Now, I already mentioned that in archery we work through a very short range of motion for a high number of repetitions, yes? And so what we need to do is in our regular training programs, we need to build in exercises that work through the full range of motion. And in particular, that overhead plane, okay? Because archery doesn't involve any of that work. It's all in this plane. That brings us to our second element of maintaining shoulder health for archers, which is promoting balanced muscle development, okay? And number 1 and 2 go hand in hand, because when we train, strength train for archery, the 2 main objectives are to work through the full range of motion, okay, to maintain shoulder mobility, but also to promote balanced muscle development. Now this shouldn't come to any surprise for you because archers are very famous for having muscular in development. And you may have already heard of the Mary Rose, okay? Now for those of you who haven't heard of it, the Mary Rose was a warship that sunk in the 15th century, and when they dredged up all the skeletons, they could immediately identify the archers because the skeletons from archers had severe scoliosis, okay? The spine was bent like a pretzel. And that was from all of the asymmetrical muscle development that the archers had developed, okay? Now, those guys were training for years with, I don't know, 120-pound war bows. You might not be shooting that much, but nevertheless, the high strain, high repetition, asymmetrical activity of archery does promote imbalanced muscle development. So through strength training, what we can do is promote balanced muscle development, and that's one of the main objectives. So if you think about it, archery is imbalanced, okay, in this plane, from your left side and your right side, but it's also imbalanced in this plane from front to back, okay? And what we tend to get in archery is on the bow arm. So for a right-handed archer, The left arm is very strong through the pecs and the internal rotators and loose through the back. And on the drawing arm, what tends to happen is you tend to get very strong scapular retractors and very weak, loose pecs, okay? So you end up with an imbalance this way and this way. And so through strength training, we must deal with this. So the most effective way to incorporate that into your strength program is with what's called Antagonist Supersets. And what that does is it essentially does one exercise through one plane of motion, and then you immediately follow it up with another exercise that works through the exact opposite plane of motion. So a great example of this would be supersetting chin-ups with overhead press. Okay, the third and final thing that you need to do to maintain good shoulder health for archery is to get regular soft tissue work. I can't stress the importance of this enough, because what tends to happen with archery is as you're training, as you're pushing yourself harder and maybe you're gearing up for a season, you'll tend to accumulate little niggles and a little bit of tightness. And the human thing to do, what 90% of archers do that I see, is they tend to just try and ignore it. They try and train through it. They try and push harder. That doesn't work. Okay, what happens is the tightness will stay. If you're lucky, it won't get worse. If you're normal, it'll get worse. And if you're unlucky, it'll lead to an injury which will put you out of action for a long time. I've seen that too many times. Now, the other thing that happens when you get a muscle tightness is the antagonistic muscle group will lose power, okay? Because the neural signal from the brain softens to protect yourself from injury. Now, let me digest that into layman's terms. So what that means is if I have a tightness in let's say my pecs on my drawing arm, what my body does is it stops my scapular retractors, the antagonistic or the other muscle group, from being as powerful, because otherwise it's going to create more of a muscular imbalance, okay? So it actually loses power through the back, which means your expansion is weak. So it's very important to keep on top of those little niggles and tightnesses so that you can actually perform at your best, but also to stop them manifesting into more serious issues down the track, okay? So the most effective way of doing this is with regular soft tissue work. And what I really recommend is that you go out and seek a really good practitioner in active release technique, dry needling, deep tissue trigger point massage. And these are some of the best techniques to getting on top of that. And you may need to go through several practitioners, okay? There are people who do this, and then there are people who are really good at it. And sometimes it's worth paying a little bit extra to get someone who's been in the game for a while and has particularly worked with athletes, okay? So there's a little trick. The other thing you can do to keep on top of your niggles is use a little tool like this, okay? And this is called a Theracane. You may not have seen it before. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to go check one out. But this is a handy little tool that can help you get into those spots that are really hard to reach normally with other like trigger balls and things like that. So it's great for getting into your levator scapula. It's great for getting into your scapular retractors and your posterior cuff. You can also use it to get into those little niggles that are really hard to get into in your pecs, your pec minor, and your internal rotators as well. So very handy tool, good to travel with to competitions. I think you can take it on a plane. You might need to explain it to the bloke at the security gate, but yeah, otherwise very handy tool. So I hope that helps you out, and I hope you've learned something from this video. If you have, don't forget to like and subscribe, because there's going to be a lot more content we're posting about how to do a lot of these mobility and strength exercises, okay? So I'm also hoping down the track to do some more features where we can go and actually do a feature on what active release technique is, which is a very effective technique for breaking up that muscle tightness, and also it doesn't have as much sort of pain or recovery time as a traditional deep tissue massage. So I'm really excited to share that with you down the track as well. Anyway guys, thanks for listening. I look forward to seeing you on the range.